If you had to bet on your life right now, would you bet on yourself? That question hit Ethan Carter harder than anything else ever had. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, and honesty had a way of cutting through every excuse he had been hiding behind for years. He stood there in front of his bathroom mirror, the cheap fluorescent light exposing every detail he tried to ignore, the tired eyes, the slouched posture, the quiet disappointment he carried like a shadow. His phone buzzed again on the sink, another missed email, another reminder of something he said he would do but didn't. And the worst part wasn't that he was failing. It was that this had become normal, this version of himself, the one who always said tomorrow, the one who planned big changes every Sunday night and quit by Wednesday morning, the one who believed that one day he would wake up motivated enough to fix everything at once. He had tried it all, the early mornings at 5 a.m., the strict diets, the intense workout plans, the productivity apps that promised to turn his life around in 30 days. But every attempt followed the same pattern, a burst of energy, a few days of effort, and then the slow, quiet collapse back into old habits. And each time it happened, something inside him cracked just a little more, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make him doubt himself a little deeper, until one day he stopped believing he could change it all. He leaned closer to the mirror, studying his own reflection like it belonged to someone else, someone he used to know, and for a second, just a second, he asked himself a question he had been avoiding for years. What if the problem wasn't that he wasn't trying hard enough? What if the problem was how he was trying? Because every time he thought about changing his life, he imagined something massive, something immediate, like flipping a switch, like becoming a completely different person overnight. But what if real change didn't work like that? What if it was quieter, slower, almost invisible at first? The idea felt almost insulting, like it couldn't possibly be enough. But it lingered in his mind, refusing to leave. And as he stood there, staring at the version of himself he no longer wanted to be, a strange thought slipped in. Simple, almost too simple to take seriously. What if instead of changing everything, he just changed one thing, just a little, just enough that it didn't scare him, just enough that he couldn't fail? And for the first time in a long time, the pressure lifted, not completely, but enough for him to take a breath, enough for him to consider something new, something different, something smaller, and maybe, just maybe, something that could actually last the next. Morning did not feel like a fresh start. It felt exactly the same. The same heavy air in the room, the same notifications lighting up his phone, the same quiet resistance in his chest telling him to stay in bed just a little longer. And for a moment Ethan almost gave in, because that was what he always did. He negotiated with himself until comfort won. But this time something was different, not louder, not stronger, just present, like a small voice that refused to disappear, reminding him that he did not need to fix everything today. He only needed to do something small, something almost too easy to fail. He sat up slowly, not with motivation, but with a kind of reluctant curiosity, as if he was testing a theory he did not fully believe in yet. His feet touched the cold floor, and he paused, waiting for that usual wave of excuses. But instead of arguing with himself, he lowered the bar so far it almost felt ridiculous. 5 push-ups, that was it. Not a full workout, not a program. Just 5. His body resisted. His arms felt weak. His form was not perfect, but he finished them. And when he stood back up, nothing magical happened. The room did not change. His problems were still there. But there was something subtle, something almost invisible, a small shift in how he felt about himself. He did one thing he said he would do, and that mattered more than he expected. He picked up a book from his desk, one that had been sitting there for months untouched, and instead of forcing himself to read a chapter, he read one page, slowly, without pressure. Then he stopped, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and that choice felt new. It felt controlled, like he was no longer trying to overpower his life, but instead guide it. Minutes later he made his bed, not perfectly, just enough to change the space around him. And for the first time in a long time, his environment did not feel like a reflection of failure. It felt neutral, maybe even slightly better. The rest of the day unfolded like any other. Work emails, small frustrations, moments of distraction. But every time he noticed himself slipping, he did not try to correct everything. He simply returned to something small, answering one email, organizing one file, taking one short walk outside, and each action by itself felt insignificant, almost pointless. But together they created a quiet rhythm, a pattern that did not overwhelm him, that did not demand perfection. And that was the part that surprised him the most, because for years he believed change had to feel intense, dramatic, uncomfortable in a big way. But this felt different. This felt manageable, almost sustainable. And yet as the day came to an end, as he sat back down on his bed and looked around the room, he realized something he could not ignore. Nothing in his life had drastically changed, but he had kept a promise to himself, and that was something he had not done in a very long time. And as small as it was, it planted a question in his mind that he could not shake. If one small action could do this, what would happen if he did it again tomorrow? The third day was harder than the first two, not because the actions were bigger, but because the excitement was gone. There was no new feeling, no sense of progress, just the same small tasks waiting for him like quiet obligations. And that was when Ethan realized something uncomfortable. Motivation had never been the problem. Consistency was, because it was easy to start when everything felt new, but it was much harder to continue when nothing seemed to be changing. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, the same internal voice creeping back in, telling him this was pointless, that 5 push-ups would not change his body, that 1 page would not change his life, that all of this was just another attempt that would fade in a few days. And for a moment he believed it, because it sounded logical, it sounded realistic, and that was exactly why it was dangerous. But instead of arguing with the voice, instead of trying to silence it with motivation or force, he did something different. He accepted it. He let the doubt exist without letting it control his actions, and slowly, almost mechanically, he got down and did the 5 push-ups again, his arms shaking slightly more than before, not because they were weaker, but because his mind was resisting. He stood up and reached for the book, reading another single page, the words blending together at times as his thoughts drifted. But he finished it anyway, not perfectly, not focused, just done, and that was enough. As the hours passed, the pattern repeated, small actions, simple choices, nothing impressive, nothing worth sharing. And yet something subtle was beginning to form beneath the surface, a quiet tension between who he had been and who he was becoming. Because every time he followed through on a small promise, he created evidence, tiny pieces of proof, that he was capable of change, and those pieces started to stack, slowly, unevenly, but steadily. By the afternoon he noticed something he had not expected, not a physical change, not a sudden burst of confidence, but a slight shift in how he made decisions. When he thought about skipping a task, there was a pause, a moment where he remembered that he had already done something today, and that memory made it harder to quit. Not impossible, but harder, and that resistance mattered, because it meant the pattern was starting to take root. Later that night, as he sat in the same room that had once felt overwhelming, he realized that nothing around him had dramatically transformed, but something inside him had started to reorganize. His identity was no longer tied only to failure. It was being challenged by small, repeated actions that told a different story. And as he looked at his reflection again, not expecting anything new, he noticed a subtle difference in his expression, not confidence, not pride, just a quiet recognition that he had shown up again. And that simple act, repeated without excitement, without visible reward, felt more powerful than any burst of motivation he had ever relied on before. And for the first time, the question in his mind was no longer whether this would work, but how long he could keep going before everything finally began to change. By the end of the first week, the routine no longer felt new, but it did not feel impossible either. It existed somewhere in between, like a quiet background process running without needing constant attention. Ethan still woke up to the same room, the same responsibilities, the same version of his life that had not magically transformed, but the way he moved through it had started to shift, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in small, almost unremarkable decisions that quietly changed the direction of his day. He no longer debated whether he should do the 5 push-ups. He simply did them, not because he felt motivated, but because it had become part of what he did. And that distinction began to matter more than he expected, because for years his actions were tied to how he felt, and how he felt was unpredictable, inconsistent, unreliable. But now his actions were starting to separate from his emotions, and that created a kind of stability he had never experienced before. Still, there were moments when the old patterns tried to pull him back, moments when he scrolled on his phone longer than he planned, when he delayed starting a task, when he caught himself drifting toward the familiar comfort of doing nothing, and each time it happened, there was a brief flicker of frustration, a reminder of who he used to be. But instead of letting that frustration grow into self-criticism, he returned to something small, something manageable, answering one message, organizing one item on his desk, stepping outside for a few minutes of fresh air, and each time he did, it reinforced a new idea, that progress was not about avoiding failure. It was about returning quickly, about not letting one small slip turn into a complete stop. This was different from anything he had tried before, because in the past, one missed day felt like the end, a signal that he had failed again. But now it felt like a pause, something temporary, something he could move past without restarting from zero. And that changed everything, because it removed the pressure of perfection. It allowed him to continue even when things were not ideal. As the days stacked together, the actions remained small, still 5 push-ups, still 1 page, still simple tasks that would not impress anyone. But the accumulation of those actions began to create something deeper, a sense of trust in himself, not a loud confidence, not a sudden belief that he could do anything, but a quiet understanding that he could rely on himself to show up. And that trust started to influence other parts of his life. When he looked at a larger task, something he would normally avoid, he no longer saw it as overwhelming. He broke it down automatically, looking for the smallest possible step, and once he took that step, the next one became easier, not because the task had changed, but because his approach had. And that shift in perspective was subtle but powerful. It turned problems into sequences, it turned hesitation into action, and as he sat down at the end of the 7th day, reflecting on what had happened, he realized something that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He had not changed his life yet, but he had changed his pattern, and for the first time, that felt like the beginning of something real. By the 2nd week, the simplicity that once felt comforting began to feel deceptive, because the actions were still small, still manageable, but the expectation inside Ethan started to grow. He found himself quietly waiting for something bigger to happen, some visible proof that all of this effort was leading somewhere. He caught himself checking the mirror a little longer, standing a little straighter, searching for changes that were not obvious yet, and when he did not find them, a familiar frustration started to rise, not as strong as before, but present enough to make him question everything again, because part of him still believed that effort should produce immediate results, that if he was doing the right things, he should be able to see it by now. And that belief created a subtle tension between what he was doing and what he expected. One morning he paused before starting his routine, his mind offering a quiet suggestion that skipping just one day would not matter, that maybe he needed a break, and the logic sounded reasonable. It always did, but this time he recognized it for what it was, not a need for rest, but a test, a moment where his old patterns were trying to regain control, and instead of pushing himself harder or trying to prove something, he returned to the same principle that had carried him this far. Make it smaller, make it easier, make it impossible to avoid. So instead of 5 push-ups, he did 3, not because he could not do more, but because he refused to let the streak break. He read half a page instead of 1. He organized a single item on his desk instead of the whole space. And in doing that, he realized something that shifted his perspective again. Consistency was not about doing more, it was about not stopping it. Was about protecting the pattern at all costs, even if the actions themselves became smaller. And that realization removed a weight he did not know he was carrying, because it allowed him to continue without needing to feel strong or motivated. It allowed him to move forward even on days when everything felt slower. As the days continued, the changes remained subtle, but they began to accumulate in ways he did not immediately notice. His mornings felt less chaotic, his thoughts felt slightly more organized, his reactions to small problems became less emotional, more measured, and while none of these changes were dramatic, they created a sense of control that had been missing for a long time. One afternoon, while working on a task he would normally avoid, he realized he had been focused for nearly 30 minutes without distraction, something that would have felt impossible just weeks ago. And that moment, small as it was, caught his attention, not because it was impressive, but because it was different. It was evidence that something was shifting beneath the surface, something that was not loud or obvious, but steady. And as he leaned back in his chair, letting that realization settle in, he understood something that changed the way he saw the entire process. Progress was not something you always noticed while it was happening. Sometimes it revealed itself in quiet moments, in small differences that only made sense when you compared them to who you used to be. And that thought stayed with him, not as a burst of motivation, but as a quiet reassurance that even when he could not see the results, they were still being built, one small action at a time. By the third week, the routine had settled into something that no longer felt like an effort, but also no longer felt exciting. It existed in a quiet space where nothing demanded attention and nothing offered immediate reward. And that was when Ethan faced the most dangerous phase of all, not failure, but indifference, because it was not the bad days that threatened his progress anymore. It was the ordinary ones, the days where nothing went wrong, but nothing felt meaningful either. He woke up, did his small actions, moved through his tasks, and ended the day without any clear sense of achievement, and slowly, almost invisibly, a question began to form in his mind. What was the point of all this if nothing felt different? It was not loud or urgent, but it lingered, repeating itself in quiet moments, trying to convince him that maybe he had reached a limit, that maybe this was as far as small actions could take him. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk staring at a task he had already broken down into smaller steps, he noticed something unusual. He was not avoiding it. He was not overwhelmed by it. But he was also not fully engaged. He was simply going through the motions, and that realization unsettled him, because for the first time, the risk was not that he would quit, but that he would continue without growth, and that felt even more dangerous. He leaned back in his chair, letting that thought settle, and instead of reacting quickly, instead of trying to fix it immediately, he observed it. He recognized that this phase was part of the process, that not every stage of change would feel intense or rewarding. Some would feel flat, repetitive, even meaningless. And that did not mean they were not working. It meant they were becoming normal. And normal was where real transformation happened. Because when something became normal, it no longer required constant effort. It became part of who you were. And that shift, though subtle, was powerful. He stood up and went through his routine again, not with excitement, not with resistance, but with a quiet sense of acceptance. He did the push-ups, read the page, completed the small task, and as he moved through each action, he paid attention to something he had not noticed before: how natural it felt, how little internal negotiation was required, how the actions happened without the mental struggle that used to define them. And in that moment, he understood something that changed his perspective again. The goal was never to feel motivated every day. The goal was to reach a point where motivation was no longer necessary, where action happened regardless of how he felt. And as that understanding settled in, the question that had been bothering him began to lose its power, because the point was no longer to feel different, it was to become different. And becoming was not something you always noticed in real time. It was something you recognized only after it had already begun. Later that evening, as he sat in the same room that once felt overwhelming and now felt manageable, he realized that the silence he had been questioning was not emptiness. It was stability. It was the absence of chaos, the absence of constant internal conflict. And for the first time, he saw it clearly. The process had not stopped working. It had simply become part of him. And that meant the next phase was not about starting again. It was about building on something that was already there. By the fourth week, something unexpected began to happen, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in quiet moments that Ethan almost overlooked. He was no longer thinking about whether he should follow through on his actions. He was simply doing them. And that shift, subtle as it was, started to ripple into areas of his life he had not intentionally tried to change. One morning he opened his laptop and began working without the usual delay. There was no long negotiation, no scrolling, no searching for the right moment to start. He just began, and halfway through the task he paused, not because he was tired, but because he realized what had just happened. He had taken action without resistance. Something that used to feel rare now felt almost natural. And that realization stayed with him throughout the day, because it suggested something deeper than habit. It suggested identity. For years he had seen himself as someone who struggled with discipline, someone who needed motivation to function, someone who started but rarely finished, and that identity shaped every decision he made, reinforcing the same patterns over and over again. But now, without any grand declaration, without any dramatic turning point, that identity was beginning to shift, not through belief, but through evidence. Every small action he completed added to a new narrative, one where he was reliable, one where he followed through, one where he did not need to feel ready to begin, and that narrative, built slowly over time, started to feel more real than the one he had carried for years. Still, the change was not perfect. There were moments when old habits resurfaced, moments when he caught himself hesitating, drifting, losing focus, but the difference now was in how quickly he responded. He no longer stayed stuck for long. He recognized the pattern and returned to something small, something manageable, and that ability to reset, to return without judgment, became one of the most powerful tools he had developed, because it removed the fear of failure. It made mistakes temporary instead of permanent, and as the days continued, the accumulation of these small returns began to create something that felt new, a sense of momentum that did not rely on intensity, but on consistency. One evening, as he sat in his room reflecting on the past few weeks, he noticed something that surprised him. He was no longer focused on the outcome. He was not thinking about how much he had changed or how far he still had to go. He was focused on the process itself, on showing up, on completing the small actions that had become part of his routine, and that shift in focus changed the way he experienced his progress. It removed the pressure to achieve something big and replaced it with a quiet commitment to continue. And in that moment, he understood something that felt both simple and profound. The transformation he had been waiting for was not a single event. It was a gradual shift that had already begun, and the person he was becoming was not defined by one breakthrough, but by the accumulation of hundreds of small decisions that he had chosen to follow through on. Day after day. By the fifth week, the change was no longer something Ethan had to think about. It had quietly embedded itself into the structure of his days, shaping how he moved, how he decided, how he responded without asking for permission. And yet what surprised him the most was not what had changed, but what had disappeared, the constant noise in his head, the endless negotiation, the pressure to feel ready before taking action. It was not completely gone, but it had softened to the point where it no longer controlled him. One morning he caught himself starting his work before even realizing it, his hands moving across the keyboard, his focus settling in without effort. And when he noticed it, he paused, not to celebrate, but to understand, because this was not how he used to be. This version of himself did not wait for the right mood or the right moment. This version simply began, and that realization stayed with him as the day unfolded, because it revealed something deeper than habit. It revealed that the structure of his identity had shifted, not through a single decision, but through repetition, through showing up when it was easy and when it was not, through continuing when nothing felt different and when everything felt uncertain. And as he moved through familiar environments, his apartment, his workspace, the quiet streets outside, he began to notice how those spaces felt different, not because they had changed, but because he had. The same room that once felt heavy now felt manageable. The same tasks that once felt overwhelming now felt breakable. And the same time that once slipped away unnoticed now felt structured, intentional. And this shift created a kind of clarity he had never experienced before, not a loud confidence, but a steady awareness that he was no longer reacting to his life. He was directing it, still in small ways, still one action at a time, but consistently, and that consistency began to produce something he had not been looking for. Results, not dramatic transformations, not overnight success, but visible changes that confirmed what had been happening beneath the surface. His work was more organized, his focus lasted longer, his energy felt more stable throughout the day, and while these changes might seem minor to someone else, to him, they were undeniable, because they represented a difference between who he was and who he used to be. One evening, as he stood in front of the same mirror where this process had quietly begun, he looked at his reflection again, not searching for flaws, not measuring progress, but observing. And for the first time he did not see someone trying to change. He saw someone who already had, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to recognize that the process was working, and that realization did not come with excitement or celebration. It came with something quieter, something more stable, a sense of certainty that he could continue, that he did not need to start over, that he was already in motion. And as he turned away from the mirror, moving back into his routine without hesitation, he understood something that would have felt impossible just weeks ago. The change he had been chasing was no longer ahead of him. It was already happening, built into the small decisions he made every single day, and the only question that remained was not whether it would work, but how far it could take him if he refused to stop weeks later. There was no single moment Ethan could point to and say everything changed, no dramatic turning point, no sudden breakthrough that split his life into before and after, and that was what made it real, because the transformation had not arrived like a storm. It had built itself quietly, layer by layer, inside the ordinary rhythm of his days. He woke up one morning and moved through his routine without thinking, not out of discipline, not out of force, but because it was simply what he did now. And as he went through those familiar motions, something clicked, not in a loud or overwhelming way, but in a clear, undeniable understanding that he was no longer trying to become someone else. He already was someone else, not perfect, not finished, but different enough that the past version of himself felt distant, almost unfamiliar. He opened his laptop and started working, his focus steady, his actions deliberate. And for the first time, he did not question whether he could follow through. He assumed that he would, because he had proven it to himself over and over again, in ways so small they once felt meaningless. And yet those small actions had rewritten the way he saw himself. They had replaced doubt with evidence, hesitation with momentum. And as he paused for a moment, looking around the same space that had once felt overwhelming, he realized that nothing external had dramatically changed. His environment was still the same. His responsibilities were still there. The challenges had not disappeared, but his relationship to all of it had transformed. He was no longer reacting, no longer waiting, no longer hoping for the right moment to begin. He had become the kind of person who moved first, who acted without needing to feel ready. And that shift, subtle as it seemed, had changed everything. Later that evening, standing once again in front of the mirror, he saw something he had been chasing for years. Not a perfect version of himself, not a completely different life, but a reflection that felt aligned. Someone who followed through, someone who kept promises, someone who did not need to rely on motivation to take action. And as he stood there, the thought that once haunted him returned, but this time it sounded different, because now he had an answer. If he had to bet on himself, he would, not because he felt confident every day, not because he believed everything would be easy, but because he had built something stronger than confidence. He had built consistency, and consistency did not depend on how he felt. It depended on what he chose to do, over and over again. And as he turned away from the mirror, stepping back into his life without hesitation, one realization settled in with quiet certainty. The change he had been searching for was never something that would happen to him. It was something he created, one small decision at a time. And now that he understood that, there was no finish line, no final destination, only a path that kept unfolding, as long as he continued to take the next small step forward.